समझ नहीं आ रहा अपने सैलरी इंक्रीमेंट का क्या करूं।
बेटा इतना क्या सोच रहा है? अपने म्यूचुअल फंड्स के एसआईपी का टॉप अप करा ले। दिस इज द राइट टाइम।
क्या? समझ में नहीं आया।
बेटा इतना क्या सोच रहा है? अपने म्यूचुअल फंड्स का एसआईपी टॉप अप करा ले। दिस इज द राइट टाइम।
आप समझा।
Mutual fund investments are subject to market risks. Read all scheme-related documents carefully.
Hello and welcome to a fresh new episode of Geopolitics with Swasti, where our consulting editor and foreign policy expert Swasti Rao takes subscriber questions on recent geopolitical developments around the world. So Swasti, a lot has been happening. The BIMSTEC summit took place this week in Thailand. The Chilean president visited Delhi. Our subscribers have a lot of questions on that. And to begin with, I will take Ravi89 Rules question, who says, Namaste Dr. Swasti Rao ji. My question is on BIMSTEC. It took 25 years to get a charter ratified by members of the group. He asks, what is the potential of this group? Connectivity plans via Myanmar look bleak with the insurgencies and civil wars there, and India and Thailand are the only two stable countries economically. His question to you is, are you optimistic about BIMSTEC and what this group can achieve?
Thank you. That's a very good question, and welcome to Geopolitics with Swasti Devdatta. So, as for your question, now BIMSTEC, of course, BIMSTEC is one of the tools through which India has tried to engage its neighborhood. It's very clear. From the name itself, it's called Bay of Bengal Initiative for Multi-Sectoral Technical and Economic Cooperation. Now, the history goes long back. It was founded sometime in 1997, and originally, I mean, the form in which you see it today sort of came up in 2004 or something. Now, as a grouping, it has about 7 members, apart from India and Myanmar and Thailand that you just mentioned. It's also Bangladesh, Bhutan, Nepal, Sri Lanka, which makes it, in total 7 members. All of them collectively represent a total GDP of a little less than 4 trillion USD. So, in that sense, of course, it's an important enough regional initiative.
Right.
The problem that happens is that it has not been able to meet its objectives, and which is very clear. So it is meant to be a bridge between SAARC and ASEAN. By that logic, it is meant to be a bridge between South Asia and Southeast Asia. So it is very much in accordance with India's Look East and Act East policy. But the problem truly there is Myanmar. Okay. And right now, I mean, lately in the last 1 week, 2 weeks, I have done a lot of, work in general, I mean, on for the print Uninterrupted and also for Geopolitics of one of the episodes where I took the Myanmar question. And then recently I had this regional expert, Deborah Eisenman, visiting us from New York, who actually specializes on Myanmar, just to basically understand the complexity of the region. So, and I actually urge everyone here to watch this particular interview that I did with Deborah in order to understand just how complex and fragile the situation in Myanmar is. Now, you are absolutely right in observing that Myanmar this region took a long time, especially when it comes to BIMSTEC, okay, in sort of coming together with with a joint statement, with some kind of a vision. And now here in Bangkok, just a couple of days ago in Bangkok, they have come up with some vision document for 2030, but none of that is going to work, frankly, unless there is stability in Myanmar.
Right.
Now, and Myanmar's instability is not just a problem for Myanmar, it is also a problem for all the countries that neighbor it. It is a problem for Bangladesh, it is a problem for India because of the Rohingyas that come into India. It is also a problem for ASEAN countries, it is a problem for Thailand and all those countries. So frankly, for anything to work in BIMSTEC, right, the first and foremost challenge is to bring stability to Myanmar. Unless that happens, nothing is meant to work. And that is the reason why not just BIMSTEC, but also, for example, this wonderfully conceptualized, highway, trilateral highway network between Thailand, India and Myanmar has not been able to take off. talking about bigger powers, they remain to be invested in the region. So, for example, European Union and Japan have been present in this region with many multi-dollar, I would say, initiatives, billions of dollars of worth of initiative here. But none of that again is going to work because they are about connectivity, that is about developing infrastructure. How do you do it with a country like Myanmar, where you don't even know who's the real stakeholder? Because unlike what many people think here, Myanmar is a region where not even the military junta controls most of the region. So military junta is just in the center. Basically, the power sharing is very, very complicated. And recently, it's been hit by a very bad earthquake.
Right.
So India has been present in the region with a lot of humanitarian assistance, as always. But for anything in the BeamStick framework to work, I think the stability of the region is a must. And this is just the biggest problem. Even if Myanmar were to stabilize, what about the emerging bilateral tensions between India and Bangladesh? What about the India-Nepal question? What about the India-Sri Lanka question? And I take these names specifically because these are the regions where China keeps doubling down with respect to BRI investments,
Absolutely.
with respect to all the other infrastructure development, with a very clearly stated objective of containing India's rise in the neighborhood. So Myanmar is the biggest elephant in the room. But even if, let's say hypothetically, if that situation were to normalize slowly and steadily, there would still be challenges. And for that to work, India's neighborhood strategy has to really find a new kind of rigor. But to your question, should we then just abandon it? No, because the point of strategic engagement is not to look at it in terms of a zero-sum game.
Right.
That is not even India's foreign policy. The way to look at it in terms of incremental engagement, and in terms of an incremental engagement, it makes sense for India to be in that region, especially to counter and give a substitute to China's dominance. In that sense, it is relevance. But should we expect a lot out of it? I don't think so.
Right. So, Swasti, as you already discussed about Bangladesh, and there has been a lot of hue and cry over Yunus's comment on India's northeast, and our subscriber Karthik Parashar has a question on that for you. He asks you, how significant do you think is Muhammad Yunus's comment on the northeast of India, and will it make a lasting impact on India-Bangladesh relationship?
Now, first of all, we have to understand that the context of Yunus's statements and the political legitimacy of Yunus himself. Okay,
Right.
we have to first look at these two things, establish these two things, and then get on the other details of what impact does it have and what should India do, etc. Now, the first thing is, of course, he made very, very strategically problematic statements. And in fact, I'm of the view that had he been a legitimately elected
Leader.
representative of Bangladeshi people, I don't think he would have really sounded so foolish. Okay, frankly, I mean, I wouldn't mince my words to say that
Right.
here is a guy who is not elected. He is simply a caretaker leader, put together by the army, propped up by the army. In fact, the army lately is not very happy with him because
Right.
he was speaking to some channel and he said that he intends to hold elections there in 4 years' time. And then the army chief came and said that no, we want you to hold the elections towards the end of this year itself. So one can see that the army himself is not very happy with Yunus. He is not elected. He doesn't represent the Bangladeshi people. He probably is enjoying some support from the army for the time being. Let's see how long it goes. And then Yunus goes to China. Pays a visit there. He's also been, of course, under Yunus. We have been seeing that a lot of high-level meetings have been happening between ISI and Bangladesh as well. So in a very, I would say, charged strategic environment, he goes to China and he makes a very unwarranted set of statements
Right.
on India's northeast. I mean, Bangladesh has no problem with India's northeast, right? I mean, China may have some problems on Arunachal Pradesh, and China has its own way of looking at the world with China's lens and very, very expansionist lens. But he goes there and he says that we are the only guarantors, right, of India's northeast states' access to Indian Ocean region. Now, technically speaking, it is true that India's northeastern states, and for that you should definitely look at the map, which is that they are landlocked in a sense, right? I mean, they're very close to the sea, but they are still landlocked. And Bangladesh, of course, is a neighboring part out there. And one of the things that bothers India then is that we have to access the India's northeast. We have a very narrow corridor, which is referred to usually as the chicken's neck.
Right.
Okay, the Siliguri corridor, which is merely few kilometers from both Bhutan and China, and it is this narrow corridor that is basically our access to the northeast. And China in last many years has been trying to ramp up military pressure on that region. There is a junction, it's called a trilateral junction, India, China, Bhutan trilateral junction. And India and China has been sort of ramping up its military infrastructure and all that, alluding to all these prevailing facts that yes, there is a vulnerability that India has when it comes to the Chicken's Neck and the Siliguri corridor, which happens to be our only access. And then you have an erstwhile friendly country's leader, okay, no matter regardless of the fact that he's not elected, going to China, that still happens to be an arch rival, even though we have been cutting cake together and all that, in a diplomatic,
Recently, yeah.
so to say, a reset in many ways, and I'll come to that later. Is it worrying? I would say yes. It could have been a slip of his tongue, right? But if it is a slip of a tongue, then maybe we have to be prepared for something which is much bigger going on in the back channels, or basically behind the scenes, that we do not know. But long and short is that yes, India, he should not have made those remarks. There is no reason why he should be talking about India's northeast in China. When India is not even present. See, if he had made a similar statement about, say, some kind of a triangular cooperation model that India also engages in with many other countries, in the presence of Indian stakeholders, it would have still made some kind of a business sense, some kind of a connectivity sense.
Absolutely.
But in the absence of India, making those comments is something, knowing that Arunachal Pradesh is a problem, India has a problem with the Siliguri, corridor and all of that, it just should raise eyebrows, and it did raise eyebrows. So one should always condemn it. Now, the other thing is that India has not given an official statement on it, and I think India is also waiting for that debris to settle, because like I said, that Yunus's own political career right now doesn't seem very clear. I don't know how long is he going to continue there. I mean, one doesn't know. Every time you ask a question, you are met with a lot of smiles and a lot of, smirks and all of that. So I think I would just leave it there. But for sure, what India should do is that India should double down on its own infrastructure development, on its own connectivity, because one must understand that we are not living in a strategically benign neighborhood. We must be keeping our eyes and ears open for a three-front destabilization.
Right.
Because even if Bangladesh would not have the capabilities to do something, it always has the vulnerability of being manipulated by China for being a destabilizing actor towards India. So right now, we don't live in a strategically benign environment. There is a three-front destabilizing from Pakistan, China and Bangladesh, which is very much a possibility. And these kind of statements, whether made in some strategic naivety or some kind of a slip of a tongue, they remain to be a cause of worry for India.
So, Swasti, following up on what we just discussed, and the whole idea of China's containment of India and with Bangladesh getting in, our subscriber Tanusu has a very pointed question for you. But before that, I must tell you that he really liked your worldview with Swasti, which featured Kishore Mehbubani, and he says, "Hello, I enjoyed the episode." And then he gets to his question where he asks that India is getting a lot of visibility in the world because politically and financially powerful countries of the world are perceiving China as a threat. His question is, while India might have managed to make the right noises, but what concrete steps can it take so India does not miss the bus?
So thanks for that compliment on Kishore Mehbubani. I think Kishore was brilliant. Now coming back to the question, I think we must give all possible credit to India. And I say this not as an Indian, but as a strategic expert, that India is the only country whose rise has not been destabilizing in the world.
Right.
You cannot think of any other country that
Absolutely.
rose and did not bring instability or chaos. Okay, so we have to give it to India. The fact that we are Indians actually make us feel proud about it. Now, does that mean to say that we should not be talking about the problems? That's not the point, and then now we'll come to the point. Now, when you say that India has been able to make the right noises, please understand that India has also made the right choices. Okay, not merely the right noises. Okay, and these kind of things are always a work in progress. So you have to sort of just establish these things at the outset, and then we go into the details. Now, India's rise has not been destabilizing. That's right. Secondly, India's position in the Indo-Pacific and in the Indian Ocean region is such that it makes a lot of sense for most of the Western partners to actually join hands with India, because the future of the world and the economic stability and prosperity of the world are actually reliant pretty much on Indo-Pacific, and especially the salience of communication. And here I mean the Malacca Strait, the Sunda Strait, etc. These are regions where China is really basically enforcing a lot of instability and a lot of militarization. So as a counter to that, perhaps India is the best bet. Okay,
Right.
that's one. And that is the reason why most of the experts that you may have heard actually say that India is in a geopolitical sweet spot. And I'm actually borrowing Kishore's phrase there. My own articulation would be that this is India's intersectional global movement. This is what I have written about it mostly. Now, long and short is that now when it comes to, so please, the first thing is that don't be under the impression that India has only made noises. There are also specific choices that India has made that actually really works in India's favor. The other example that I can give you is that against the alliance mindset, which is a very zero-sum game, either you're with us or without us, India has always believed in building collaborative frameworks. And if you carefully see how the geopolitics of Indo-Pacific is playing out, one of the reasons why the middle order powers find India to be so dependable and so bankable is because India is the only country that is in the position of talking to everybody. So multi-alignment has its own commonsensical advantages, and you cannot take it away, especially at a time when the world is reeling under so much uncertainty. So first things first. Now coming to your question about China. Does that mean to say that, India can outcompete China or something just by virtue of being multi-aligned? I think it's a very, very complex question. See, as far as capabilities is concerned, no, India does not match China in any capability, right? Military capabilities, no. Economic capabilities, no. Okay. Power projection, no. In fact, from China's perspective, the only worthy peer or the only worthy competitor that China thinks it has is the United States of America.
Right.
China doesn't think about India as much as we think about China. And I have said it again and again. Now, the couple of things that we can rectify in order to sort of close this capability gap, even if we cannot, our point is not to outcompete or outperform. Our point is very simple. We have certain intrinsic, I would say, problems with China. LAC is not the only problem. LAC is a problem that we've inherited from the British. Okay, LAC is not of our making. Okay, LAC is something that we've inherited from them, and maybe at some other point I can get into the details of why is LAC so problematic. But we have certain other problems. Hypothetically speaking, let's imagine if LAC problem is tomorrow solved, would India stop having all problems with China? India and China would still compete for the leadership of the global South.
Right.
And most importantly, China is trying to undermine the Western order by creating an anti-Western order which is dominated by Beijing. On the contrary, India is not interested in an anti-Western order because as far as things are non-Western, it's fine because India believes in multi-alignment. We are also members of the Quad, we are members of the BRICS, we are members of the SCO and so on and so forth. So for us, anything which is non-Western is kosher because why should everything be dominated by the West, right?
Absolutely.
But the problem is that we are not really on board in undermining the Western order to make it an anti-Western order, which is led by and dominated by Beijing. That is the reason why when it comes to things like de-dollarization, Indian Foreign Affairs Minister, External Affairs Minister, Dr. Jaishankar has to come on record again and again saying that BRICS currency is not on the board. It's not on the table. It is not in India's interest because what we refer to as BRICS currency is basically a currency which is dominated by the yuan. So the de-dollarized trade is not going to be dominated by rupees. The de-dollarized trade of the world is going to be dominated by yuan. So de-dollarization is basically yuanization, and India has no fiscal interest in strengthening China's grip over de-dollarized trade. So that's just one part. And what I'm trying to tell you here is that these are things that India does not share with China, okay? And for that, India gets into this network of different kind of partnerships, different kind of, nimble plurilaterals, like the trilaterals, like the quadrilaterals, etc. And India should also basically enhance its own capabilities. Now, when I said that capabilities-wise, there is a gap, of course there is a gap. China, around 2000, the year 2000, the Chinese decided that they were ready to take the big leap. And they decided that by 2035, they are going to be powerful, if not more, at least as powerful as the United States, armed forces. And then they started their reorganization. Now, while India is still stuck with Jal Thal Nab, and this is a discussion that I had with one of the early episodes of Worldview with a fighter pilot, and you can go and watch it. It's with the Group Captain Ajay Helawat, and he said that while India is still stuck with Jal Thal Nab, which is basically Army, Air Force, and Navy, China have gone far ahead and have created 3 more domains, and those are space, cyber, and electromagnetic spectrum. Okay, so why is India having these problems, Devdatta? It's very simple. See, India is a country without a national security strategy, without anything that gives us a kind of a direction to put together all these things in a coherent, cogent manner. On the contrary, the Chinese set a goal for themselves and then pursue that goal. And there is then a lot of problem with respect to how much are we spending on a defense, how much are we spending on a, those kind of things. So these things do work against India. So one thing that India needs to do is that India needs to get its domestic capabilities in order. Now, ideally, we should be making in India, but end of the day is that if tomorrow there is a war, we have to go and fight with whatever we have. So in that sense, we also have to be realistic. Okay, so doubling down on our domestic capabilities, 2025 has promised to be the year of reform. So let's see what comes out of that. But not just that, I have to speak about the economic sector where getting FDI has been a problem for India, and all the China plus one diversification didn't really work out in India's favor, because those investments that were not going to China didn't land in India. They landed in Vietnam, they landed in Singapore, they landed in Cambodia, those kind of countries. And now Donald Trump has become a chief disruptor. So Donald Trump has put so many tariffs, and but don't be under the impression that that is going to help India. Basically, that is going to then make the rest of the world again more dependent on China, because we were all trying to diversify away from China. Okay, so we have to create an ecosystem which is investment friendly. We have to create a kind of a coherent, cogent national security vision which is time bound, and we have to create a very, I would say, we have to rework our neighborhood strategy in order to make sure that neighborhood is as stable as possible, because frankly there is only so much instability that we can handle.
Absolutely. So, Swasti, a lot of compliments coming in for your interview with Professor Kishore Mehbubani. Ravi89 Rules, our subscriber, again says that I watched your interview with Professor and it was a great conversation. He also says that we need more voices from Southeast Asia. And then he goes on to his question where he says that how do you see the decision in hindsight now of India to not join the Regional Economic Comprehensive Partnership, or the RCEP? His question is, do you think we as in India should join RCEP soon and be more confident and challenge our domestic producers and manufacturers and expose them to competition? And then he goes on to ask, these protectionist approaches have not resulted in domestic industry becoming more competitive over years, and our consumers don't get choice in the market either.
Now, very quickly, thank you again for watching the Worldview with Swasti for Kishore Mehbubani. As far as getting more voices from Southeast Asia is concerned, I can say that you should stay tuned for the next episode, because there I have got two experts, one from Manila and the other from Japan. So at least Manila, Philippines is again Southeast Asia, so you would hear more from that region. Now, coming to your question on RCEP, now RCEP is of course the world's largest free trade agreement between a lot of countries. It is China, Korea, ASEAN countries, Japan, etc., etc. Now, very quickly, should India join RCEP, and all that you said about protectionism quickly? Now, India has not joined the RCEP. In fact, some years ago, the rhetoric was so strong that countries like Japan, and especially this is before the assassination of Shinzo Abe, who used to be Japanese prime minister, that said that they are going to make sure that India joins the RCEP, because they cannot really think of such a comprehensive economic arrangement between this region, countries of this region that doesn't have India. So it was in many ways a kind of a recognition of how India's stature is rising economically, etc. And still, India decided to stay out from RCEP. Now, according to some write-ups and some approximations, people said, or researchers said, that those in favor of India joining RCEP said that India could actually get about $60 billion in income by 2030 if it had joined the RCEP. So, on the other hand, are critics that would probably say that India should not join the RCEP. And I think in your question only, you gave a certain answer to it, which is that A, our trade remains very protectionist. So RCEP would have meant that we would be forced to open our market and to give market access to Chinese goods, which obviously we cannot outcompete China in competitiveness either. Right. And one of the things that I did not take up in the earlier question when I was talking about capability, so I did talk about investment, I did talk about armed forces capabilities, etc. And I did say that it is in India's interest to manage China diplomatically. But long and short is that when it comes to the economic side of things, China remains to be the factory of the world. Okay, China remains to be the manufacturing capital of the world. Okay, the West is finding it very difficult to de-risk from China, and most of the de-risking that is happening right now is actually happening at a very tactical level. It is not happening at a deep structural level. I'll give you an example. Now, I keep telling you that, and the viewers, through different platforms, is that the more India exports to the West, because the West doesn't want to import directly from China. So the more India exports to the West, okay, on the surface it looks as if there is de-risking happening. But because India is not a manufacturing hub, it lands up importing more from China. Right? So basically, the overall dependency on China is not gone anywhere. And that is the reason why, I'm just connected to the previous question, it makes sense India to diplomatically manage China, especially at this time when the world is so unstable. Now, circling back to RCEP, it's again also understand that most of the members that have joined the RCEP, like for example, South Korea, Japan, ASEAN countries, they have only seen their trade deficits rise with China. So RCEP has not been able to make sure that these countries are also having an equitable trade with China. That's one. Now, the other thing that you have to understand is that coming back to India and why India's FTAs are such a problem. Right now we are negotiating an FTA with the UK, with the EU, and also perhaps later with the US. We are putting together some kind of trade deal. Donald Trump has literally held a gun to our heads and told us to open our markets, and we are like, okay, we are doing it. Anyway, what I'm trying to say here is that, India has not been able to fully utilize its FTAs. So in technical terms, the FTA utilization rate for India has always been very low. And that is why when the Modi government first came, they put a hold to all the FTAs. They said that, okay, we are going to be reviewing those FTAs. And they also scrapped all the bilateral investment treaties because investment was not coming and the trade deficit was widening. Okay. So they said, let's find out what is wrong. And that was the context in which the government came out with the PLI scheme, which is production linked incentive. Okay. But and Make in India and all of that. The idea was that you have to make in India, but how do you make in India if you don't have the right investments? Because please remember that demonetization and GST and those kind of things had literally wiped out the small and medium enterprises from the country. Okay, and that is something that we still do not understand how grave were its economic consequences. So very quickly, India's FTA utilizations remain low, and out of those 15 countries that are members of RCEP, India already has FTAs with 13 countries. Okay, that include your ASEAN, South Korea, Japan, etc. Now, despite those agreements and despite the fact that we have excellent, economic diplomatic ties, with these countries, we have only been at the receiving end of trade deficits. Okay. So where is the logic that because if 13 out of 15 countries, we have already, some form of FTAs or trade deals where we are at trade deficits, now joining RCEP will not land us even bigger trade deficit because, I mean, look at our trade deficit with China is at about $100 billion. Right? So what I'm saying is that joining RCEP or not joining RCEP, signing an FTA or not signing an FTA, see, none of this is going to work till we are really serious about making a business-friendly, investment-friendly ecosystem in India. And that remains our biggest undoing, the red tapeism, the regulations, the lack of law and order in many states, right? These issues have to be dealt with a completely, I would say, professional manner. Our problem is that we tend to get emotional about it, We tend to look at it in terms of, oh, why are you criticizing India, right? I mean, India is such a good country. Of course, that's what I started with, that India has not only made noises, India has also made some very good choices, okay? But at the same time, I think when you are more realistic about the problems you have, you can put together the best minds of your country to actually find solutions to them. Okay, and the solution is definitely not about saying that the West wants to sort of hatch some kind of a conspiracy against India. I mean, these theories don't really go too far. This is a Cold War era mindset, and one has to come out of that mindset, right? The Dr. Jaishankar keeps saying that we have a lot of very irrational anti-Westernism also in the country. End of the day, I think what really needs to be underscored again and again is that till the time we are not able to get enough FDI, we will not be able to really emerge as a manufacturing hub. Absolutely. And till the time we are not able to really become the manufacturing hub in some sense, right? It doesn't make any sense for us to join these arrangements, because end of the day, we will only give them more market access. on paper there will always be some kind of an investment that we will welcome, but the investments will not come, and with the investments not coming, we will always be at the receiving end of, like I said, the lower utilization of and basically we will not be able to come out of these critical dependencies. So it doesn't make sense. The change has to be from within is probably the final answer.
Swasti, following up on the long discussion that we had on China, another subscriber, Anubhav Saxena from Bangalore, has yet another question. And he asks that China is sweet talking to India again, which we just discussed. His question is, India has been bitten by China many times from 1962 onwards. Still, we keep falling for the same fake narrative of China every time. Is it due to military complex we have from China, or is it more than that?
Now, you're right in your assessment that China is a champion at sweet talking and doing the exact opposite, and that is referred to as China's double speak. And you're right there, your reading is right. I think what you're seeing right now, the kind of rapprochement that you're seeing between India and China with respect to cutting the cake and all of that, now this is not being done out of any naivety on India's part. This is simply being done because in the very uncertain world that we inhabit today, with so many wars and so many, other challenges, disruption of supply chains and all of that, and especially a very, very complicated presidency under Donald Trump, okay, it really makes sense for India to diplomatically manage China. And in the earlier part of the world, the geopolitics episode, we were discussing that as far as capabilities is concerned, there is no way that we can fight an all-out war with China. I mean, tactically speaking, yes, we can, and I think the Chinese also know it. And at a strategic level, there is also this nuclear strategic stability that both these countries are nuclear weapons. So an all-out, full-fledged war is not really on the radar. But having said that, I think what we are more worried about all the gray zone warfare tactics that China does, the informational warfare that China does, the cyber warfare that China does. So basically the gray zone, right? And so please understand, this is not a complex. This is a realistically speaking, these are the drawbacks that we have, okay? So it makes sense. I am of the view that we cannot win an all-out war. And in fact, right now, our focus should be on actually exploiting the geopolitical sweet spot that we have, in the sense that we should be shrewd enough, we should be strategically wise enough to understand that at this juncture, do we need to go and fight? Or do we need to manage it in order to let our economy prosper, grow, etc.? And I belong to the latter camp, which is that no, वॉर आप नहीं जीत सकते अभी, तो लड़ने का कोई मतलब नहीं है. And there is no point also stoking this ultra nationalism, okay, in the populace, because we are a democracy. We are not like Xi Jinping. Xi Jinping, whenever something goes wrong for him, he's all the time stoking ultra nationalistic frenzies. Okay, we don't need to do that. We need to be more realistic, and I am of the opinion that we should manage it diplomatically. And the other thing is that please see that why is it that we are pushing for a diplomatic management, right? If not a solution. As far as the LAC is concerned, right, the solution is nowhere in sight. Okay, despite dozens of meetings of different levels, right, from the topmost level to different levels, there is no real solution. The LAC remains to be contested. The LAC remains to be, very, very problematic. In fact, it is undemarcated. It is not just disputed, but it is also undemarcated along the three different sectors, right? So China's there was a time when China used to say that we want a package solution. India said that we want a sector by sector solution. But frankly, in the last many years, you've not heard anything like that. So our ambition right now is very limited, that we want to go back to the status quo ante, where things were before April 2020 in Galwan. And as far as that is there, we are just trying to manage it in a diplomatic way.
So Swasti, on Wednesday, the US's Liberation Day, Trump laid a tariff tizzy, which has affected markets around the world, and a lot of subscribers have questions on that. I will begin with Karthik Parashar's question again, who asks, what trade agreements does India have in place already, or we are negotiating to navigate through the tariff war that the US has declared to the world?
No, so Karthik, if I get it right, do you mean that the trade agreement that we are now readying with the US, or the other trade agreements that we are doing in order to compensate for the tariff wars that the US has unleashed? So actually both these strands of thought are actually quite legitimate. Now with respect to the US first, see, well, India was one of the few countries that tried to make very early outreaches, to the United States under Donald Trump. So right from Prime Minister Modi to Dr. Jaishankar, Piyush Goyal, everybody was going there and after every few weeks. But despite that, and despite the fact that we had already agreed, the finance minister had stood in the parliament and said that we are going to be reducing tariffs and removing tariffs. And in fact, before Trump's Liberation Day onslaught, okay, India has already confirmed that we are going to be reducing tariffs to the tune of $23 billion, dollars, which is going to affect the trade worth $23 billion. Indian companies, by the way, I don't know if you know, have already invested more than $40 billion in the US. Okay, because that's what Donald Trump wants, no? India has also confirmed that it is going to be buying more hydrocarbons, and India will also be buying much more military equipment from the US. And a lot of that military equipment, frankly, we don't need as much because we have domestic options for it. So, for example, the Stryker armored vehicles, right? I mean, we already have a domestic version, which is called Crestal, which is developed by Tatas, etc. But at the same time, we have gone out of our way to really sort of try and reduce the $40 to $45 billion worth of trade surplus that we have with the US, okay? And that has started showing some results also, because in the last few years, okay, ever since we have tried to give it some real thought, we have actually reduced the trade deficit by 3 billion or so. So if things were going the way they were, we would have also reduced it much more. That's what Donald Trump wants, because Donald Trump doesn't like trade deficits, okay? So that's one. But by that onslaught that he did with respect to, 26% of tariff, and these are discounted tariffs, by the way. So I have written a column on it. You might like to take a look. I have been very, very critical of whatever he's done, and I've called it completely nonsensical. And but long and short is that whatever he's done now, he is definitely going to make it more difficult for not just for India, but for the rest of the world also. And from India's perspective, see, I have gone on record saying again and again, and back then it drew a lot of criticism, but now it's becoming very clear. I think America is extremely important for India. That's why you see that the Indian government is making this, bending over backwards and making all possible, early outreaches to the US government, because US is India's most important strategic partner. Right. So I think Donald Trump has just sort of made it very evident, okay? As long as there was Biden administration, we were criticizing them. So it was a blow hot, blow cold relationship with convergence on the Indo-Pacific. But I think Trump administration has kind of made it very clear that India is very serious about preserving its relationship with the United States. And that's exactly what India is doing. Now, where things get a little complicated is that India is readying some kind of a trade deal with the US. And this is again to keep Donald Trump appeased. Donald Trump is going to come to India for the Quad Summit sometime in September and October this year. So both sides are planning to sign some kind of a deal. And for that, for example, India is already talking about subsidies on EVs. And that's not what the local Indian automobile makers want. I mean, that's not what Tatas and Mahindras want, but Indian government has gone out of its way to show that we are willing to do it. So it all shows that India is willing to co-opt what America's strategic and business requirements are, because we are very serious about the investments we get from the US. The remittances, by the way, we get from the US also happens to be one of the biggest sources of India's remittances, okay? And all the other convergence on, economic matters and services and all of that. So that's one. It does complicate things for India a little bit. The second thing that really complicates things for India is because the tariffs are not only on India, the tariffs are on everybody, okay? And what he has done by levying tariffs to the tune of 46% or so, or 48% on countries like Vietnam, is that he is creating a disincentive for all those actors that diversified away from China. So what happened after COVID and after Russia-Ukraine war, especially as resilience of supply chains became very important, was that there was a very tangible push, okay, especially in Western countries and Western, manufacturers to to basically push their manufacturing factories and units from China to other countries. And that is what I mean when I say that those investments that didn't come to India, but they landed in countries like Vietnam and Singapore and Cambodia, etc. But now that Donald Trump has hit those countries with so much tariffs, so basically then those countries were then exporting to the US, right? And now he's put tariff there. So frankly, ask those manufacturers that really shifted all their factories and manufacturing units from China to those countries only to be slapped with more tariffs, right? So what is their incentive to really move things away from China? Because at least in China, it was cheaper for them to manufacture. So this is what he's doing, that there is a huge setback to all the efforts around de-risking from China and diversifying away from China, and it is in nobody's interest. And that is why this entire this entire narrative of America trying to create a level playing field is completely nonsensical, because it is not based on any economic logic. And for more details on this, please read my latest column, or you can watch the video column as well, where I go into the details of why this is a problem. That's first part. The second part, very quickly, is that yes, it does open a lot of strategic sense for India to now double down on FTAs with those countries that seem to be more stable. Okay, and I can give you some examples. I mean, India is negotiating an FTA with the EU, and India-EU bilateral trade is also humongous. And there are problems on mobility. There are problems on, for example, again, market access, and a big problem on CBAM, which is Carbon Border Adjustment Mechanism. But then, at least with those partners, we have a very constructive conversation to unlock climate financing for us, so that we are also able to change our technological capabilities to do something about the carbon leakage, right? With Donald Trump, suddenly there is no communication. It's just being operating in the theater of the absurd, right? So that's one. UK is another partner with whom we also have trade surplus, and we are also negotiating an FTA, and we are hoping to have one soon. And like I said, we have already taken the FTAs pretty much in detail, but basically working on why India is not able to utilize the FTAs better. I think those kind of things are very, very important. And also, India should become a part of as many connectivity projects as possible and open more strategic gateways into different parts of the region as possible. And from India's perspective, when you see the Indian government making outreaches to Middle Eastern partners, or to Latin American partners, or for example creating more strategic gateways into Europe, or those kind of places, you definitely understand why the logic is the way it is. And this is what we should be doing. So we should be looking at, like I said, as a way to sort of strengthen ourselves, not keeping all our eggs in one basket, because I think to be America's friend, at least under Donald Trump, is worse than being America's enemy, because he has literally gone after its allies first.
Swasti, since we are talking about regional factors, our subscriber Karthik Parashar has a question from you on Afghanistan. We have two questions on Afghanistan. I'll lead with this one first. And he asked, how is the current relationship between India and Afghanistan, and what role does Afghanistan play in our foreign policy?
See, Afghanistan, for a long time, we had a red line approach towards Afghanistan, especially after the Ghani government fell and the manner in which it fell, because Taliban then took over, and then we had a very red line approach to terrorism. So initially we were like, okay, this is like a very strict red line approach. We saw the red line approach is not working, because all other stakeholders in the region were speaking to Taliban, and we were perhaps being prisoners to our own ideological, so to say, preferences. And then came the era when we started to blur these red lines, and we started to realize that if we want to retain our relevance in the region, we will have to speak to whoever is the most important stakeholder, and Taliban were the most important stakeholder. That's the first part. So diplomatically speaking, we did change. So you saw from red line, there was a blurring of those red lines, and then we started the communication. Now the behind the scenes, kya ho raha hai, I'm not sure, because I'm not privy, but I hope that there is communication going on. And it makes sense for India to speak to whoever is the stakeholder in Afghanistan, because please remember that we have done massive investments in Afghanistan under Ghani government, thinking that America is going to be the guarantor. Okay, and then America said bye-bye, and we were in a problem. Okay, because whatever space that America left by way of withdrawing from these regions were usurped by China. Okay, so we have to rethink our strategies suited to the changing realities, right? So I think one has to be very clear on that, and that is what strategic realism calls for. Now, secondly, at an official level, we still don't have an embassy or a consulate or something. So we just first started talking to them, which makes sense. The other thing which has worked in this favor is the fact that Taliban did not really fall prey to the Pakistani design. And I think that was something which was a very, very, which was welcomed in India because, Pakistan, especially you remember that very infamous Tea Party, right? So without getting into the details of it, but basically what Pakistan thought that now that Talibanis have come and the brothers have come and there'll be some sort of a joint thing against India. On the contrary, we saw that the TPP, etc., the Pashtun nationalism took off, and then they have their own problems with respect to the Durand lines. And just to make matters worse for Pakistan, Taliban did not, condemn or did not really, say anything controversial on the abrogation of Article 370 in Kashmir. So that also somewhere showed us that Taliban wants to take the conversation forward, right? It doesn't want to be mired into the same Pakistani narrative of Kashmir, like that. So that has also worked in our favor. And why we are interested in Afghanistan, of course, to balance Pakistan, because like we mentioned that Pakistan is also having these insurgencies, and in the last one I had taken this up. Whether it's beneficial for India or not is a different thing, but our interest in Afghanistan is something which is very valid. And the other thing is that think of our passage to Iran. If we are not in Afghanistan, then we don't really have a passage to Iran. And then also remember with Iran and then with the INSTC, we are trying to connect now Chabahar to it. And that is important. Why? Because we have China sitting in Gwadar. So we are trying to sort of develop Chabahar. So I think it's a game of balancing. Afghanistan has a very, very important route. It's like on that way. The strategic location is very important. And also the more stability. Like I said, my stand is very clear on this, that India has to try and be a stabilizing factor, in all these regions, because it's not just about a tactical instability working in our favor for a few years. It is about this long game. Wherever there has been, wherever India has not been present in a constructive manner, that strategic, economic, diplomatic space has always been usurped by China. So we have to develop a long-term strategy, keeping in mind what China is doing to encircle us, right? Not just by way of the land route, the Central Asian countries, Afghanistan, Central Asia and Iran, etc., but also by way of the maritime route. So when you look at it like that, you will suddenly understand that Afghanistan is important for India, and whoever is the important enough stakeholder, India is going to be careful in what kind of a narrative it puts out. But like I said, that communication has to be constructive and communication has to be keeping in mind India's strategic interests. And yes, Afghanistan is important there.
So I think, Swasti, you've already answered the second question that was there on Afghanistan, where the user Krishna Odenia had asked that whether engaging and cultivating relations with Taliban would be in the interest of India or not, since they are being seen as a risk. So whether India should cultivate the relations, but I think we have already answered that.
So in many ways, Devdatta, I have already answered that question. Strategic pressure on Pakistan is important. We also have to, and then finally, it is up to us to sort of put in place what kind of pathways are we looking at? Right. Are we looking at some kind of a, triangular cooperation with, for example, we want to have some other external actor present in what we do. We use that model a lot for Indo-Pacific region, for Pacific Island countries, etc. For a lot of African countries, we use that model. So do we want to keep it like that? It is up to us, frankly. But what I'm trying to say is that it is in India's interest to not only engage with pro-India or pro-democracy factions, because that has not worked, Just look at what happened in Bangladesh, right? We were engaging Hasina and then suddenly she went out of the, of the picture, and suddenly India was in doldrums out there. But long and short is that we have to come out of this approach of only engaging pro-India factions, because we have to engage important stakeholders in the region. And if Taliban are the important stakeholders in that region, whether we like it or we don't, whether it is up to our democratic sensibilities or not, it makes sense for us. And that's precisely what I've been answering. And as far as what really the Indian government does for that is something that we will come to, because please understand, and at this juncture, I think because we are repeating a few things again and again, Hans Morgenthau has been a classical realist. And in 1948, he wrote a book called Politics Among Nations. And he's one of the first classical realists, Of course, many of his theories and many of his, propositions were later challenged and then refined. But there's one thing that he said that makes a lot of sense, which is that morality of the human race is different from moralities of the nation, because nations act in national interest and there are no permanent friends and no permanent enemies. So he was basically, talking about that. So yes, we would like to be as much politically correct. That has always been India's image, and that's why people respect India. And I understand what your concern is with respect to what the Talibani leaders have done to their women and to the girl child, etc. But what I want to say is that when you think of it from a strategic lens, you have to really change that level of analysis. And finally, we will see what really comes out of it. But engagement on is something which works for us. Okay, breakdown in communication is not something that works, because please remember, we are not operating in a benign.
So with that, Swasti, I just have one last question from our subscriber Aditya18893 on the recent visit by the Chilean president to India. And he asks that recently Chile president visited India on an official trip. All years we have been hearing about India's relationship with the US, EU, Canada, Australia, etc. But nothing has been heard from South American countries' perspective. How Indians share relations, or how India shares relation with South American countries like Argentina, Brazil, etc. And how important a place do they hold in our strategic decisions and foreign policy?
It's a great question. Now, I must say, Devdatta, thanks for asking me this question last, because I'm not an expert on Latin America, but still I'll try to sort of put together a few things. I think the first thing that I can do is that I can tell you to go and read this wonderful article which was put out by the Observer Research Foundation, which is called Redrawing India-Latin America Relations in the 21st Century. It's published somewhere in 2023, so it's quite recent as well, and it gives a very good overview of our respective relations with different countries of the Latin American region. So that's one. Please take a look at that region, that you should be hearing or learning from a real expert, a domain expert. Okay, now very quickly, as far as my knowledge is concerned and whatever I've put together for answering your question, a couple of things are very clear. As far as Chile is concerned, you can go and look at the joint statement. It's not been a very important actor in the region, but then it kind of really fits perfectly well into India's outreach to different regions in the world, and Chile being one of the say members of the Latin American community. For sure, our most, I would say, robust ties in that region happens to be with Brazil, for obvious reasons. Brazil is a part of BRICS, and Brazil, and you know that as long as there was this very Cold War era strategic environment, the South-South dialogue, which was quite important for the Latin Americans, for Africans, for India, and our solidarity, the post-colonial solidarity that we share, was very strong once upon a time. And this is not really 200 years ago. This is only until a few decades ago. Now, so you will see a lot of convergence when it comes to, say, climate issues, when it comes to, a non-Western world order and trying to find a place under the sun. So those are, I would say, thematic kind of things, which you can find very easily when you read this particular article that I just shared. But talking particularly about Brazil, yes, BRICS, of course, is one very important framework that we are a part of, where Brazil is also there. The second thing is that, I don't know if you know that in, the DRDO has something called the Airborne Early Warning and Control Systems, or the AEW&CS. Now, this program that the DRDO has actually is based on the Embraer model, and Embraer is a Brazilian defense industry. And there's a reason why I'm mentioning Embraer, because very recently there was also, India has been looking for a medium transport aircraft, and Embraer has also emerged as one of the key contenders, because the defense industry, they have a good reputation generally, and they are also much cheaper than the Western counterparts, and they also offer, a joint production, etc., and setting up their factories, etc., in India. So that pretty much fits the Indian DAP 2020 guidelines. So I thought I should mention this, because this usually gets missed in the larger political discussion on South-South cooperation, etc. So Embraer, yes, and that our airborne early warning and control system that we have, which is Netra, here is based on the Embraer, ERJ 145, which were procured from Embraer sometime in 2008 or so. So, and not just that, right now that we are having a defense industrial corridor, there we have two in India. One is in UP and one is in Tamil Nadu. I think we are also pitching for investments from Embraer, precisely because of the fact that the equipment is good. It's much cheaper than the Western counterparts, and they have shown a lot of interest in investing in India. And if you now know that investment in India has not been so easy, so we are really trying to sort of work on that. So I think in that sense, Brazil and a Latin American company, which is Embraer, sort of becomes important and relevant for us. But long and short is that I truly am not an expert on this region. So you please go and, read this particular article that I've listed, and maybe one of it. And in fact, I was just thinking, Devdatta, I think we don't really talk about Latin America so much. And especially after the Ukraine war, actually, Latin America has become very important because, until the war happened, Ukraine was the biggest supplier of sunflower oil to us. And after the war, actually, the imports, they were slashed by 70% or something because of obvious reasons that the country at war. Yeah. And then a lot of Latin American countries actually started exporting us sunflower oil. So because of a lot of reasons, I would say that it makes sense for us to actually get somebody from the region that can speak about the strategic, economic, defense industry logic, and maybe you can probably see a worldview on it very soon.
With that, thank you once again, Swasti. This has been extremely engaging.
Thank you so much, Devdatta.